I'd like to welcome everyone. A good afternoon to all. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for joining us for our latest author event. My name is Riley Brockington. I am a trustee with the Ottawa Public Library and proud city councillor for River Ward. Our author this afternoon, public policy strategist and former Canadian Senator, the Honourable Hugh Segal. Mr. Segal has worked tirelessly to bring about policies that support the most economically vulnerable in our society. His book, is a passionate argument, not only for why a basic annual income makes economic sense, but for why it is the right thing to do. I'd like to thank the Ottawa International Writers Festival and Library and Archives Canada, our partners in putting this timely author event together. Your support makes it all possible. I look forward to our continued collaboration in the future on other events. Please visit the Ottawa Public Library's website to find out about other upcoming programs and to access a wide selection of library resources online. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sean Wilson from the Ottawa International Writers Festival to say a few words. Thank you and have a great afternoon. Merci et bonne fin de journée, and over to you, Sean.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us for our first live internet event. Obviously, we're sad not to be gathering in person, but grateful to all the authors and publishers and hosts who are helping us transition online. Thrilled to be working with the Library and Archives Canada and the Ottawa Public Library on this. We have some other events coming up and a very exciting fall season to share. This book by Hugh Segal, Bootstraps Need Boots, is one of the most remarkable reads that I've come across in the last many years. And it's an idea, this notion of a guaranteed annual income or basic income that Senator Segal has been promoting tirelessly for years and years. And it's so interesting that in the context of this current pandemic, it seems to be something that is finally catching on, this notion that we all need to be taken care of, and that poverty, the cure for poverty, is in fact money. Our host this afternoon is the amazing Mark Sutcliffe, an award-winning broadcaster, columnist, author, blogger, member of our board. He runs the wonderful CPAC Politics Today podcast that I listen to every morning, and it's a thrill to have Mark hosting this event for us. We hope to see more of you soon virtually and can't wait until we're able to gather again in person. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy this session, and let's give a virtual welcome to our host this afternoon, Mark Sutcliffe.
Thank you, Sean, and great to see everyone virtually. And Hugh, welcome to you. Thank you so much for doing this with us today. Great to see you.
I'm delighted to do it. I started my love affair with Ottawa when I was a student at the University of Ottawa back in 1968, and have spent large chunks of my life in and around the city, so any chance to connect with Ottawans is always a huge, rare privilege.
Well, great to see you, and you've spent so much of your life here. I think you're deeply connected to this city, and you're deeply connected to this cause as well. And I wanted to explore that a little bit to begin with. There are good ideas, and then there are good ideas about which we are passionate. And often that passion arises out of some type of personal connection to the issue. So why is this your thing, the idea of a guaranteed annual income?
Well, having a view on poverty in one's later years is helped by having grown up in poverty in one's younger years. My family was a poor working class family in Montreal. My dad went through long periods of unemployment before there was unemployment insurance and ended up as a cab driver. My mother had to work as an all-night cashier in the medical arts pharmacy in downtown Montreal to put some food on the table. So while they were two loving parents and I had two wonderful brothers and the family was generally speaking a pretty happy place, one saw the impact of poverty pretty regularly. I remember on Sunday nights after dinner, there'd be the pile of bills from the grocery store and from the butcher shop and from the pharmacy and medical bills, because this was before universal health insurance in the 60s. My dad would say, well, let's pick any two because that's what we can afford to pay this month. and we were often behind in our rent and all of those sorts of things. And so you see the dynamics that that produces in a family, and there were many families in Montreal who would have been in much worse shape than us. So that's where I acquired a sense of what poverty does in terms of creating a sense of fear and anxiety in people's lives. Both my parents died very young, in their 50s, because poverty actually is a perfect predictor of bad health and a perfect predictor of needing medical care sooner. And so that's where I developed, if you wish, an innate sense of how important the issue was. And then the political side of it happened when I was 12 years old, and Mr. Diefenbaker, who was then Prime Minister, came to our public school in our riding to present a copy of the Canadian Bill of Rights to our principal, which had passed the House of Commons in 1960 under his government. And he made a very non-partisan speech about what he referred to as the Canadian family table, and that he saw it as his role to make sure there was always room for everybody at the family table, rural, urban, this background or that background, executive, laborer, farmer, fisherman. And that's what I began to realize, that there could be some connection between things that you knew in your soul had to be fixed and what politics could be as a way to try to achieve some of that. And then when you saw things like what Mr. Douglas did on basic health care and healthcare insurance, and when you saw other changes that came in over time, you began to realize how the way in which we deal with poverty in Canada is a very inefficient, a very bureaucratic, and a very, if I might say so, punitive way, especially under provincial welfare programs, where we don't give people enough to live. They are actually given less than half the poverty line in their province. So it just occurred to me over time, various different roles I had the privilege of playing, that always looking for a way to do that in a way that was more humane, that was more respectful of the individuals, and actually produced more efficiency and encouraged people to work, something which our present welfare system does not do, would be a good thing to try to achieve. And I've spent a large part of my life trying to make that happen.
Let's talk a little bit more about your childhood, because some of my favorite passages in the book are when you're sharing stories from that time in your life. They're really powerful. And as you alluded to, I think you obviously had a happy childhood, and there was a lot of love and warmth in your home, from what I could tell. So what is the toll? I think there's a risk sometimes that we mythologize the childhood of people who are disadvantaged and emerge from those circumstances. You've had great success in your life, and so that could be misconstrued as an argument that everybody does have equal opportunity in this country. But what is the toll of poverty on children and on families?
Well, I think the most important thing that poverty does is it steals choice from people, from their life. It steals time. Poverty, you'll often hear folks who aren't for much change saying, well, poverty is very complex. Poverty is produced by a whole bunch of other issues of one form or another. I think that using the complexity argument is a way to avoid the issue. Poverty is really simple. It's about not having enough money to pay your bills. And I'm not talking about living at some highly comfortable quality or standard of life. I'm talking about, rent, food, heat in the winter, transportation, clothing. And the vast majority of people who live beneath the poverty line in Canada can't pay for all those things at any one time. And they're in a constant scramble to figure out how to put food in the fridge, because food insecurity is a big issue. They're in a constant scramble to figure out how to get clothes for their kids to go to school. They're in a constant scramble to figure out if their kids can go on a gym trip with all the rest of the kids in grade 4. It's a constant struggle. And quite aside from what that does to their lives, we know that because of that stress And because of that constant struggle, they end up being folks who end up at the emergency ward of our hospitals with a chronic illness that could have been dealt with in some other way, but they have no other place to go. There's a wonderful story that was told by one of the general practitioners at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto about what he refers to as the $1,007 sandwich. Someone is in the emergency ward. They have to be triaged by the nurse practitioners and the physicians to see what their problem is. They're suffering from some difficulty associated with a chronic disease of some sort. And after they're triaged and they're assessed, and perhaps a prescription is written, it's clear that the person really could benefit from a hot bowl of soup and a sandwich. So, to St. Mike's credit, they provide a hot bowl of soup and a sandwich. And the cost of that hot bowl of soup and sandwich to all of us as taxpayers is $1,007. $1,000 for the triage and the medical overhead that's necessary to treat the individual who's at the, and then the $7 is for the bowl of soup and the sandwich. And wouldn't we be better off if we could provide enough for free people beneath the poverty line so they could do better and have the money they need so they can get their own soup and sandwich and live a higher quality life? We know too that people who live beneath the poverty line, their kids don't do quite as well at school. We know that people who live beneath the poverty line sometimes have greater challenges with substance abuse of one form or another. And we know that sometimes they get into difficulty with the law at a greater rate than people who are better off. And all of those phenomena actually are a huge cost to society as a whole, well beyond the meager amounts that we distribute for welfare. Here in Kingston, we have about 6 prisons within 50 miles of the downtown. And even though the poverty rate for Canada is about 10% nationally, which means that in some provinces it's more, in some provinces it's less. It's much higher amongst our First Nations brothers and sisters. But somehow that 10% of the population is represented by 85% of the guests of Her Majesty's in our prisons. What does that cost? We could be doing so much more to make our society more productive by dealing with poverty efficiently and effectively before it wreaks the havoc that it does in people's lives than just dealing with the results of not addressing it properly.
So on that point, I know we can make the case that it's fairer to have a guaranteed annual income for everyone. Can we also make the case that it's cheaper? Because the cost of it is one of the first things that people raise. This is going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to give everybody a basic income.
Well, that question was put to the parliamentary budget officer by one of your local MPs, Pierre Poilievre, some years ago. And he's not a proponent of this, by the way. He would be, I would think, quite opposed to the idea. And the parliamentary budget officer said that, well, if you were to bring it in as the pilot project in Ontario suggested with that structure, then that would probably cost something around $40 billion, grosso modo, on a national basis. If, however, you reduced the amount of federal programs it would replace, that would reduce the cost. And remember, anybody who received a basic income out of Ottawa on a national basis would no longer be eligible for provincial welfare because their income would be too high. And provincial welfare costs taxpayers about $20 billion a year right across Canada. So you would be in a circumstance where you were reducing all those costs without counting the positive impact on the healthcare system, the education system, the penal system, of actually having less people living in poverty. So my view would be, just like they said when Mr. Douglas brought in universal health insurance, we can't afford it. All the doctors are going to leave. We're not going to get the medical care we need. Now we have realized that it would have been the most financially irresponsible thing for governments back then in the 60s to have done, not to have brought in universal health insurance, because it makes our healthcare system, while not perfect, certainly way better than what's available south of the border. And we spend far less on healthcare per person than do the Americans and some others. So like anything else, there's an investment to it, but is it affordable? I think it's very affordable. And what we have learned during the COVID, if I may say so, and the pandemic, is that CRA, thanks to the hard work of the public servants who work there, has the ability to deal with that kind of distribution far more efficiently than EI or provincial welfare. So these are some of the lessons learned, which I hope governments take forward and try to make the system more efficient, more liquid, and more productive than our existing welfare system is.
All right, we'll come back to the issue itself, but I want to talk more about some of the stories you tell in the book, particularly from when you were young. And you have to tell the story of the toy box, because I think it demonstrates so many things, including how generous your family was despite your circumstances, how caring and considerate they were. But also it was a big moment in your childhood, wasn't it?
Well, and let me be clear, if there was generosity and decency at that time around the story of the toy box, I would not have been one of the people who was being generous of spirit. I came home from school, I think it was something like grade 4, and I had a wonderful mahogany toy box in my bedroom, which I think had been inherited from someone. It had a large, big seat in which I kept all my bolo bats and slinky toys and Montreal Canadiens whistles and all the rest. And there are hangers on the top where you can hang your coats and your bathrobe and your hats and all. And it was really, before the advent of the CPU and the computer and the laptop, it's really the center of my little boy's life. And I came home one day and it was gone. And all the toys were in shopping bags up against the wall. And so I tried to figure out, when I asked my brother, who was a student at Outremont High at the time, not far from where we lived, where the toy box was. And he said, I'm not sure, you better ask your father. And I did ask my father, and my father said, well, our neighbors upstairs on the 3rd floor, we lived in a triplex in Lower Outremont at the time, they ran out of money for heat. They asked if I could lend them some money for heat, but I didn't have any money to lend them because I'm out of work. But they needed to keep the furnace going for a few days until their welfare check came in. And so I gave them your toy box because it was mahogany. It would burn slowly. It would give them a few days of heat. It was a typical Montreal February, which was very, very cold. And, when I get a job, he said, my dad said, I will get you a new toy box. Well, I didn't have an ounce of generosity. This was my toy box. It had been given away without my permission. And Mark, I was so angry that I refused to eat dinner, which was a huge protest on my part at that point in life. When my mom came home early the next morning from the all-night drugstore and got me up and made sure I got showered and dressed and whatever to go to school, she said, I've made your lunch, and what was in dinner last night, I have put in sandwiches in your lunch so you can get to eat that. And as she always would say, don't eat the dare cookie first, eat the celery first, etc., and all the rest. And she said, now, why didn't you eat supper? And I said, well, I was angry. And what were you angry about? And she said, well, Dad gave away my toy box to the neighbors upstairs. And my mother said, you're in trouble when your mother uses all your names, right? Hugh David Segal. She said, Hugh David Segal. Monsieur Lacroix upstairs did not have enough money for coal. He asked your dad for some money. Your dad didn't have any money, but he didn't want Mr. Lacroix and the family to be cold. So he gave him your toy box so it would burn for a few days. And you have the temerity and the gall to be upset about that? I'm ashamed of you. Now, when your mother says that to you at the age of 9, that's a pretty crushing proposition. And then, as was often the case, we walked up de l'Épée, the street on which we lived, and took the bus on Bernard down to my school on Mount Royal and Park Avenue. And she would ride with me, and she said, it was a public transit bus. And she said, now, I hope you will apologize to your father for your attitude. And I said, I don't think I have to apologize for anything. He should be apologizing to me. To which my mother said, I am more ashamed of you now than I was earlier this morning. So I left the bus bawling my eyes out because, you know, whether or not I was right or wrong, my mother was upset with me, and that was a pretty substantial proposition. And it took me some time to actually figure out that A, there were people in town who were doing worse than we were financially, economically, and B, it took my dad did absolutely the right thing. But for some time, I was just angry that I'd lost my toy box. And I think that was the beginning of an awareness on my own part that the convenience of a toy box is not more important than the ability of a father to keep his family warm in the dead of a Montreal winter. And that was the beginning of the development of some sense of conscience and some sense of concern for our fellow human beings.
Really powerful moment and a great story. So I think you touched on this a little bit earlier. Do we need to start thinking of poverty as the cause of other issues in our society as opposed to thinking of it as an outcome itself?
I think that's right, because when you think about it as an outcome, and there are, by the way, there are many reasonable people who are experts, economists and others who take the view that it's an outcome as opposed to a cause. They will list all the many issues that are producing poverty. It could be whether someone is a recent immigrant and doesn't speak the language. It could be whether there is some physical or mental disability of some sort. It could be because their parents were in a very low income circumstance. It could be because there was substance abuse there's a million things that can be laid out. There could have been perhaps family breakup at some point that produced less income, which produced poverty. When you make that very long list, it's clear that the state, if it spent every penny it had, could not solve any of all of those problems. So that, of course, becomes a wonderful analysis for doing nothing, for just going with the flow. Whereas if you take the view that poverty causes most of the things we're concerned about, poverty contributes to family breakup, poverty contributes to sometimes more difficulty with the police forces, poverty contributes to bad health outcomes, to bad educational outcomes, and we know that we know how to fix poverty. We've been addressing the risk of poverty for senior citizens for many, many years through the guaranteed income supplement, where every senior citizen in Canada, 65 and over, is guaranteed that whatever their other sources of income may be, no one will live on less than $1,200 or $1,300 a month. And the GIS, federal government, tops people up so as to fill the gap between whatever they may in fact have from other sources and $1,200 a month. So we know how to do this. This is not rocket science. The federal government has done great work on the child benefit, which has also reduced poverty amongst families with children who are lower middle class and or lower class, lower income people. But we are not doing it for people between the ages of 18 and 64 who find themselves in poverty through no fault of their own. And one of the things that we have learned during the pandemic is that when 7 or 8 million Canadians wake up one morning and they had a job last Tuesday, and they don't have a job now because, you know, there's been shutdowns of all the non-essential businesses, they had no income, that, you know, we have a duty as a community to be helpful to them and to give them some way to rebuild their lives. So the question becomes, if we can do it in extremis for 8 million Canadians, why can't we have a better system of helping the 3 million Canadians, 3 to 4 million, depending on how you count, who live beneath the poverty line all the time? And what I will often hear from my right-wing friends is, well, you know, if you pay people who aren't working, why would they ever work? To which the answer is, well, actually 70% of the people in Canada who live beneath the poverty line have a job. Many have more than one, because no single job generates enough income to actually cover their costs in the community in which they are living. And often it's part-time work, and people have to have more than one part-time job to generate enough. And we've seen the results of that in our long-term care homes across Canada, which have had a very, very high difficulty rate during the pandemic, because many of the employees were hired on a part-time basis, not given enough hours to generate benefits. Hence, they had to work in different places, and they became unwilling vectors of the disease because they were going from place to place to make an income. So what's the cost of that? And how much better off would we have been if those people doing that work knew that they had a basic amount they could count on, and if they wanted to do that work, they still would be at the poverty line or better and not well beneath it, which is where many, many are.
All right, before we go any further, I just want to mention to everyone that we are going to open this up to your questions in a few minutes, in about 10 to 15 minutes from now. There is, if you're joining us on Zoom, a Q&A button that you can click on and you can type in your question. We'll get to as many questions as we can coming up in a few minutes. So you've started to touch on some of the obstacles that we face if we're ever to do something like this. And I want to explore that a little further. And also, you've talked about how long this has been a priority for you, and I know for many other people as well. Why has it taken so long, and why is it? This is a question that I have trouble answering when my children ask me. Why is it in a country like Canada, where we have so many resources, where we have so much opportunity, where there is enough wealth to go around, enough shelter to go around, enough food to go around, that we have this problem distributing it? Why have we not fixed this yet? We have the capacity to do it, and yet we haven't. Why is that?
Mark, it's a great question. There are three groups who are totally opposed to this idea, and they work very, very hard to keep progress from being made. The first group is sort of on the far right, who really do buy into the kind of 18th century view of poverty, which says if people are living in poverty, it's because there's some moral weakness on their part.
You deserve it, basically.
Yeah, and it's a distortion of the Protestant work ethic. The Protestant work ethic, that people work hard and do well and contribute to society and do well for themselves, is there's nothing wrong with that. But to go from there to say those who are living beneath the poverty line are somehow morally deficient, and therefore we have to make sure that we give them as little as possible so as not to encourage them, is a big part of where the far right is. Now, over on the far left, to be fair, there's another group that is just as opposed, but to be fair, for different reasons. Their view is we have carefully crafted programs, welfare programs, programs for the handicapped, etc., which are run by competent, hardworking public servants in most of the provinces and municipalities. And they are usually members of public sector unions, which is fine. And we don't want those jobs to be replaced by an automatic transfer of money every month, because those people will be out of work. And we actually think that you really do better for low-income people when you're crafting programs that are well designed, by the way, by the swells, by the folks who think they know what everybody else needs, and then low-income people will accommodate themselves to the programs that the rest design. And I don't question their sincerity or their integrity, but I think they're wrong. I think it's actually colonialism to say that governments and the wealthy will decide what programs the poor people need, and the poor people will accommodate themselves to those programs. I think we should be in a circumstance where people get a basic amount of money, not beyond what would be absolutely essential, but the basic amount of money. We can talk numbers later if you like. Let them make their own choices with that money. Milton Friedman, many years ago, on the right, used to say in the United States, of the Chicago School of Economics, he used to say that if you made the American government responsible for the Sahara Desert, there would be sand shortages in 3 years. Give the money to the people. Give the money to the low-income people. They will know what to do with it. And they will not set up tax evasion accounts in the Bahamas. And they will not be putting their money in bank accounts in Switzerland. They'll be spending the money on food and rent and on clothing and on transportation, which will recirculate in the economy very effectively. So those are the people on the far right and the far left. The other people, and I think this is probably true in most departments of finance anywhere in the world, public servants in the departments of finance, well-intentioned, hardworking, patriotic, and all the rest, believe that one of their primary jobs is to preserve the discretion of the Minister of Finance and the government to decide how to spend the revenues that come in every year from the taxpayer. And that every time you have a large program, which is statutory, i.e., if someone falls beneath a certain level, they get automatically topped up. Well, that has a cost, and therefore that reduces the discretion of how money might be spent for the minister and the government. And it's our job as public servants to oppose any single program that might do that, which is why they slow down things like naval ship procurement, because the amount of money involved is so substantial. So those are the three groups. Now, those are three pretty powerful groups who are always kind of doing their best to slow this down or keep it from happening. And that's why, in effect, it has not come into effect in our country yet. But there's chunks of it that have come into effect. And I think we have to learn from what works, and we have to learn from what doesn't work, namely provincial welfare. And for example, EI is a creaky old program from the 60s and 70s, which no longer covers 40% of those Canadians who are out of work. We found that out very directly during this particular crisis. And a whole bunch of Canadians now don't sign up after they leave high school or college with one company with which they stay for 40 years. They do different jobs in different places. Some work freelance, some are creative, some are artistic, some are doing laborer's work or construction work, piece by piece and job by job, and there's gaps in between. And those are the people we should be trying to find a way to give some protection to when their income evaporates beneath a certain line. And we have been doing that with the HST tax credit automatically now since it was brought in by Mr. Mulrooney and Mr. Wilson. I remember when I was telling my graduate students at Queen's in April, make sure you file your tax form. And they would say, well, we don't have any money. Why would we file a tax form? To which I would say, well, because when you file your form, and if you earn less than $30,000 a year, Revenue Canada will put $400 in your bank account automatically so that you're not paying too much of your low income for the GST, for the HST. So we have systems by which we can do it much more efficiently than provincial welfare now does.
Is there not another reason as well that that it's difficult to get large numbers of Canadians to notice poverty at a level where it becomes a political issue? That it's easier, for example, to do a GoFundMe campaign for a middle-class family that's undergone some hardship and have a bunch of people make donations to that than it is to get a large number of Canadians to deal with a systemic and persistent problem like poverty?
There is a bit of a tendency in our society and generically in our media and also in our day-to-day life to look away from things that are profoundly unpleasant. And I think that's part of why we don't look at poverty as directly as we should and see it as a challenge we all have to embrace. But we are finding out now, for example, many of the people who are in the so-called essential services, they are working part-time in supermarkets or in pharmacies or in other activities, they are in fact the working poor. They are in fact people who are working, who show up every day and do their job. They are getting, up until the pandemic, a very low hourly wage, and they are struggling. And they're the people, by the way, who didn't have the option of staying home. When government said stay home and stay safe, they had to go to work. But wouldn't we be better off if those people had some choices in their life like other folks do? And I think one of the positive, and every crisis produces some positive opportunities for change. One of the positive opportunities for change is to realize that the people we are cheering and we are thanking, we're banging our pots for and doing music for, to thank them for being on the front lines, many of those people are not being paid very well at all. They don't even have the right to sick leave. Think about that. Premier Wynne, to her credit, did bring in changes to the labor code that would have given everybody sick leave, including part-time employees, and the present Ontario government rolled that back. And now we're seeing the price we pay for that in our present circumstance.
Do you have a specific model in mind? Because when people talk about a basic income, it can mean a lot of different things, obviously. So is there a model that you subscribe to?
Yeah, let me tell you the model that I don't subscribe to. I don't subscribe to the Andrew Yang idea, and he was that candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, of sending everybody a check of $1,000 every month just because they're breathing, on the assumption that the tax system will claw back from wealthier people most of that money. First of all, I don't think the tax system is that efficient. Better off people pay accountants on a regular basis so that they can manage to pay as little tax as possible, and that would apply right across the board. And those wealthy people who happen to get a $1,000 check, put it into a sheltered investment, then they wouldn't end up paying tax on that. So I don't think that's efficient. I think the system we should use is the one that we have been using for GIS and for the GST tax credit, which is very simple. You file your taxes. If you fall beneath the poverty line, you get automatically topped up by the system. And the old argument, which used to be, and I think, by the way, this should be a federal program, the old argument that's been made that, well, you can't really change that as your circumstance changes. Well, tax regulations now provide that if I have a job that pays $50,000 a year, and I get another job which pays another $50,000, so I'm earning $100,000 a year, I have a duty, and my employer has a duty to tell Revenue Canada so they can start to deduct more money from my paycheck. And by the way, that works the other way as well. If I had a job that paid $100,000 a year and I lost half of it, so my income was cut in half, I could tell Revenue Canada, and that would reduce the amount of taxes they took every week or every month or whatever from my taxes. So we now have a system that does that. And what Revenue Canada has shown with the emergency grant that was brought in, that people could actually go online on a Monday if they had their birthday in the first few months of the year, file, make the declaration, the statutory declaration, and then the money could be in their bank account by Wednesday. So we have the ability to be far more efficient than our existing EI or welfare programs are. And that, I think, would make a huge, huge difference in terms of, as Governor Polos said the other day, he said very clearly that a CERB-style change to income security would help build and fuel the economic recovery, because it would sustain confidence, sustain people's ability to spend and be part of the economic mainstream. So I think that's one of the lessons that I hope governments at all levels and political parties at all levels give some serious thought to.
So you would top people's incomes up to bring them above the poverty line. What programs?
Well, let me roll back the tape. So let me just tell you exactly what we did in the pilot project in Ontario.
Right. And by the way, on that was, yep. I know it was scrapped, what, about a year into what was supposed to be a 3-year program,
That's right? That's right.
Did we still learn some lessons from that?
We did indeed. So the basic income that a person was getting from Ontario Works, euphemistically called, was about $680 a month, depending on where you lived. Worse, if you wanted to earn money to improve on that, and you earn more than $200 a month, that would be clawed back dollar for dollar from the basic grant, which is the effective 100% taxation on your earned income. Conrad Black doesn't pay that much on the top $1 or $2 million of his annual income. So that discouraged work. And every welfare program in the country essentially does that. It discourages work. What the pilot said, we're going to give people a basic grant of $1,300 a month. The difference is we're not going to discourage work. We're going to encourage them to work. And if they do work, they'll pay some tax on what they earn, but they'll get to keep a lot of what they earn, so there's an incentive to work. And when they get the same amount of income as they would have gotten in the basic grant, they'll pay the same level of taxation the rest of us do on all of our earnings on a regular basis. And the study that was done by the Department of Economics at McMaster University on the recipients of the basic income pilot in Hamilton indicated that people were using that money exactly as most of us would have thought would have been a rational thing that we would have done ourselves. Some use the extra money to start a small business to increase their income. Some used the money to get more education so they could get better job prospects going forward. One woman in her late 40s admitted that she used the money for the first time in her life to buy a new winter coat because she'd never had a new winter coat ever in her life. And one older woman who had a disability said that she used the money to buy a new walker because she couldn't afford a better one, and the one she had was really quite inadequate. So this was not people who were spending the money on drugs or alcohol. There's this general, I call the gang who always says you can't trust low-income people to know how to spend the money. I call them the coal in the bathtub gang. And I use that term because back at the turn of the 20th century, there was a great debate in British politics about whether when building the homes for miners in Northern England, you should put a bathtub in every home. And the argument was, well, you can't put a bathtub in these poor people's homes. They won't know what to do with it. They will just fill it with coal. It won't achieve the sanitation and other benefits you hope it will. Well, of course, they were wrong. People who had bathtubs knew exactly what to do with bathtubs, just like people were wrong when they were against desegregation, and they were wrong when they were against the women's vote, and they were wrong when they opposed all immigration, and they were wrong when they were against human rights. I mean, this is one of those measures of civilization and progress that I think we have to be frank about, and bringing everybody to a point where they get to participate in the economic circumstance of the broader society and have a base beneath which they will not fall. Winston Churchill used to say, I am against all limits to how well people can do, but in the vicissitudes of life, we need balustrades on both sides of the stairs. So when you trip and fall through no fault of your own, there's something to hold on to. And that, in my view, is what this basic income proposition is really all about, Mark.
All right, and very quickly, before we move to audience questions, what does that mean in terms of replacing other programs in your model? What would that mean? No more provincial welfare programs, no more employment insurance?
Well, yes. When the GIS was brought in by the federal government at a level of $1,200 for seniors, a lot of provincial programs for seniors were reduced in size because it was being covered by the feds. If we brought in a basic income at something like $1,300 to $1,500 a month, all those folks living beneath the poverty line, having proven their need by filing their taxes, would no longer be eligible for provincial welfare. So most of the provinces will begin to phase that out and spend that money on other good and important things, such as home care, such as education, special ed, such as people with the challenge of autism in their family. They'd have the flexibility to do that. But I'm only referring to basic income as a way to deal with the cash transfer part of what government does to individuals. I'm not for reducing programs that deal with people who have learning disabilities or programs that teach folks new skills so they can work. I'm not for reducing any of that. That's an important role for government to play. But I am for doing the cash transfer to people in a way that's more efficient, more humane, more productive, and encourages work.
Okay. If you have a question for Hugh Segal, the author of Bootstraps Need Boots, please type it into the Q&A portion of Zoom, if that's the format that you're using. Here's a question from one person saying, you write towards the end of your book about feeling somewhat at odds at times with the federal Conservatives while in the Senate, and in particular with the provincial party in their cancellation of the Ontario pilot. With that in mind, how well do you think the title of Conservative still suits you, and why do you still choose to identify with the party?
Well, I'm not a member of any political party as we speak, so that tells you a little bit about where my thinking is. But look, my view of conservatism is what was referred to by Benjamin Disraeli as one nation Toryism when he was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and that was the same approach that was taken by Mr. Churchill, same approach taken by R.B. Bennett, and people like Stanfield and Davis and Mulrooney. You can only have peace, order, and good government, which is part of our underlying constitutional value, if the idea of order has within it the idea of fairness and equality of opportunity. Our friends on the left often believe in legislating equality of outcome, that everybody ends up in the same place no matter how hard they work, and we tax it away from people who are doing better. I'm not really in favor of that, but I am in favor of equality of opportunity. We do it in terms of education, we do it in terms of healthcare, we do it in terms of our seniors, but we're not doing it in terms of poverty. And that's my definition of conservatism. One nation, not one nation in terms of English and French, East and West, but one nation in terms of those beneath the poverty line and those above the poverty line. We're all in one community, and we have to have a systemic approach to creating that community for everyone.
Just on that, and to pick up very quickly on some of the other points you made, you talked recently about a system that's more humane. There's a lot of judgment in our current system, isn't there? Even as we are seeking to help people, even from the programs that aim to do the most and to be as fair as possible, there's inherent judgment in the system.
Well, that's right. The Manual of Administration for Ontario Works has 900 rules. So if you're a hardworking public servant, caseworker, managing a caseload well beyond anybody's ability, but doing your best, you have to constantly be judging and auditing and notarizing and determining and investigating whether your recipient is still eligible based on those 900 rules. And I think that's a misuse, frankly, of everybody's time and effort. Do we have to be careful because it's public funds? Absolutely. But when somebody files their tax form and they sign the bottom line, that's a statutory declaration. It's a serious crime to lie on that tax form. That is a better protection of the public interest than whether or not you can fiddle a welfare officer here and there for a few extra bucks in one context or another. So I actually think that we would have a much better and more honest system if we made it simply about people's lack of income for whatever reason that is measured, testified to by your tax form, and then responded to by the system. When we wheel somebody into the emergency ward at the Ottawa Civic Hospital, we don't get into a debate about, well, maybe their problem is because their diet was bad. Were they exercising enough? Have they been smoking too much? Is that why they're having chest pains? No, we don't do that. We deal with the problem. The nurses and the practitioners and the trauma surgeons, they all engage fully to stabilize, stop the bleeding, and then deal with the issues that might otherwise be addressed thereafter. But why would we deal with poverty in a different way? Why would we get into a series of judgments about how they might have lived their life or should be living their life before we decide that they need enough to get by? It just makes no sense at all.
All right, another question from the audience. This person gives you credit for working across party lines during your career in politics. And of course, you were appointed by a Liberal Prime Minister as a Conservative Senator. Are you concerned about the high degree of tribalism in today's politics and the villainizing of political opponents?
Yeah, I do think that part of what social media has allowed folks to do now, and some people do it in a constructive way in terms of targeting markets for ideas and suggestions and involving more people in politics, but some do it in a very negative troll-like way, where the only way they can deal with an issue is to attack not the policies of the other side, not their premises, but actually to attack their motivation. And what I've learned in my time in politics is you never question someone's motivation. You may question their judgment. You may say there's a better way to do this, let's work on this together. But when you attack someone's motivation, that's when you develop the kind of tribal, nasty politics, which we see extensively in the United States, and we are seeing beginning to roll out in some contexts here in Canada. And I think it's very, very unhelpful. And I'm hopeful that we will come to our senses through this pandemic to realize that the things that we share across party lines are much more important than the divisions. And the divisions are important in terms of different views on how best to do something, but they're not important in terms of what we want to achieve for society as a whole. And sometimes, look, opposition politicians have to get noticed. And to get noticed, they have to say things, and they have to say things that will show up in a short clip, or now even show up in the Twitterverse, and that produces some of those negative pressures. And I think we have to stand back, reflect on whether that's really how we want our society to go forward.
Question from Maria: are there successful programs in other countries that we can point to as examples that might be good for Canada? Where's the best example for us to turn to here?
Well, in North America, in Stockton, California, they have had a regular basic income approach, which has had a huge impact on people's quality of life. It's been managed, done by the municipal government effectively. There have been successful pilots in places like Finland and in Kenya and in Barcelona and elsewhere, where the program has indicated positive results at a sustainable and affordable level of expenditure. And now the Spanish government, in fact, has made a commitment that after the pandemic, they're going to bring in a basic income as a fundamental policy of their social safety net in that country going forward. That is the position of the Scottish government, by the way, and that is why there are now very successful pilots rolling out in places like Glasgow and parts of Edinburgh. So there's a movement that is going in this direction, and the question is, will Canada be part of that in terms of leadership, or will we wait until everybody else does it and then decide whether we think it's a good idea? And I hope it's the latter and not the. I hope it's the former and not the latter.
And what about this is a question from Amanda. She writes that many programs are far behind actual costs, including rent for residents, particularly in places where the cost of living is very expensive, like the big cities in Canada. So how do you make it work in a way that's universal across the country, even though the cost of living might be different in Toronto from some other place in the country?
So the present government of Canada has decided that there's a new definition of poverty, not the old low income cutoff, which was if your income was less than half of the median income in your community, you were deemed to be living in poverty. The new system is something called the market basket measure, which says, what are all the costs in your part of the country? What is the number that you need to basically pay rent, basically buy food, basically have transportation and clothes? And we should then be distributing programs that get people to that, as close to that number as is humanly possible. So that number will be different in rural Prince Edward Island, and then it'll be in urban Ottawa. And it'll be different in downtown Toronto than it'll be in northern Saskatchewan. We have the capacity now, we did it with the EI program over the years, where the amount of money and the eligibility issues were different across the country based on the economic circumstance. Revenue Canada does that now. They know where you live and they know what the costs are, and they look at your costs and your income to see whether that is a story that is believable. So we have the capacity to make that decision and build it into the system and do it in a way where people in a more expensive area would get a little more than those people who are living in a less expensive area. And we can still do it as a national program.
Quite a few people have asked, what's the next step and what can they do as Canadians to move this cause forward? So what is your advice on that? There's really two questions there. What can individuals do, but also is the next step to relaunch some type of pilot project in one Canadian province, for example, as was the case in Ontario before it was scrapped?
So I would argue, Mark, that we're really beyond pilot projects. We've had a bit of a pilot project in the CERB program that was launched instantaneously, very quickly, to their credit, by the federal government for the 8 million Canadians who woke up one morning without any work or any prospects. So we know how to do it, and we know that we can. The most important thing that individuals can do is to let their member of parliament know that they actually think it is time to do on the issue of poverty what we have done on the issue of universal health insurance. That is an intrinsic part of what equality of opportunity should mean for all Canadians. And now that there's a minority parliament and the New Democrats and the Green Party is in favor, and I have listened carefully to the Prime Minister's answers to questions about this, and Bill Morneau's answers to questions from Senator Pate about these issues. And they've always said, well, we're dealing with the short-term challenge now, and that's what our priority is. But they will have to figure out in finance as we speak, I'm sure they're working on it as we are talking, what's the transition from CERB and various other programs to a steady state going forward. Well, it cannot be, in my judgment, a transition to where things used to be before we got into this circumstance. It has to be to a system which deals with poverty more efficiently, more effectively, and affordably. And it'll cost us a lot less to top up 3 or 4 million people beneath the poverty line than it will to give $2,000 a month to 8 million people who are out of work. And once Ottawa announced it, the provinces could go their own way and decide what they're going to do with their own programs. I would not get into an endless federal-provincial negotiation because the male lifespan is 82 and we don't all have much more time. But it is an opportunity for the federal government to show leadership. And what a tremendous legacy of this administration it would be, and of this minority parliament it would be, if we finally addressed this issue in a way that was rational, it was pragmatic, it was productive, and it was fair.
And a tremendous legacy of this crisis as well, potentially,
Indeed.
right? If we were to arise, if that were to arise from these circumstances that we finally woke up to this issue. So do you think then that based on the CERB and the GIS that there's enough there to be able to say, let's not study it anymore, let's just put it in place?
We will have the numbers on the CERB because people had to file with Revenue Canada, so they'll know the ups and the downs. We know the number on the HST tax credit, low income tax credit. It's been operating for decades. We know where that leads us. We know what the numbers are on the child benefits, so all the data is there. And this is about filling the gap for those people who don't fall into any of those categories. So the notion of launching another pilot, I mean, it's always good to go and get more data, but the issue is what do we do now to make a change that will make a difference, and how do we keep it affordable? How do we keep it responsible? And how do we keep it humane and effective? And I think we have the skill sets now to do that, and all we need is an act of political will by the government and Parliament of Canada to take it to the next step.
What, under normal circumstances, of course, we'd be wrapping up in the next few minutes and then people would have a chance to come and chat with you and you'd sign their books and that sort of thing. That would be the kind of event we'd be having today were it not for the coronavirus, of course. So in the absence of that, what else do you want to leave this audience with, the many people who have tuned in today and have wanted to hear your perspective on this? Obviously, many of them supporters of the idea, but others who have come in perhaps wanting to hear more with an open mind about this proposal. What do you want to leave people with?
I would leave folks with 3 thoughts. One, they said we couldn't do universal health insurance as a society, and we did. They said we couldn't deal with the high levels of seniors' poverty back in the 70s, where 35% of people above 65 were living beneath the poverty line, and we did. They said we couldn't deal with the difficulty of families with children who needed help, and this government, to its credit, found a way to do that effectively and efficiently and humanely. So this is the last piece in the puzzle, those who live beneath the poverty line. And as long as we fail to address it, we leave a gaping hole, a weak underbelly in our society, which will produce huge costs and huge negative ramifications in the future. We now have the capacity to get it done. And it's something I think people of goodwill of all political affiliations or none should be trying to make happen as quickly as possible.
Very well said. Now, in the few moments that we have left, I want to ask you to tell the story of how you came to interview Joan Baez, because you tell a great story in the book. And
well,
I think that's
great. I was the editor of the monthly newspaper in our little high school in Montreal, and Joan Baez was coming to Montreal to perform. She had just had a pretty serious breakup with her significant other, and was staying with her team at the Windsor Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And because
her significant other, who happened to be Bob Dylan, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
And because the media had, as the media can often do, focus on these sorts of things, they had said, no media interviews, I will be at my concert, you can cover the concert, end of story. And we were sitting around and we decided, well, maybe we could find a way to get an interview. And we went to talk to the principal of our school, and he said, look, I read that Ms. Baez and her team were vegetarians, didn't eat any meat. Why don't you get a big smoked fish deli platter from the Brown Derby, which was a place of some substance in Montreal, send it with a note down to the Windsor Hotel, and indicate that it's a high school newspaper and you and your colleague would love to come down and ask about her music and whatever. And what can you lose? Well, we did that. We sent it out about 10:30, and then about 12:30, we got a call from one of her managers saying, if you can be in the Windsor Hotel at 3 o'clock, you'll get an hour with Miss Baez. She'll be glad to answer your questions. Well, we thought we'd died and gone to heaven. We grabbed a cab. We grabbed the tape recorder. It was a web cord tape recorder about the size of a small Korean car. And we rushed down by cab. And the person who met us in the lobby, you could smell the smoked salmon on their breath. And they said, thank you for that tray. It was very nice. Took us up, and then we spent an hour with Miss Baez, who was very, very eloquent and kind, and talked about some interesting linkages, which I had not. She was very anti-war, anti-Vietnam War. And she made the case to us when we asked about that. She said, well, you know, the sons and daughters of wealthy Americans aren't being shipped to Vietnam. It's low-income Americans, many of whom may be Hispanic or Afro-Americans, who are fighting that war. So the cost of poverty for some people is actually not just the choices in their life, but whether they get to live or die. I had never thought about that before in my life. And her elegance and her dignity and her integrity just struck me as really very compelling, and it had a huge impact. And we wrote the story in the magazine. We were the only ones in our little high school magazine. We're the only ones who had an actual interview with Joan Baez. And the other newspapers got interested in it afterwards, but by then she had left town for her next gig.
Good for you. That's a great story. Among many in the book, which again is called Bootstraps Need Boots, One Tory's Lonely Fight to End Poverty in Canada. Hugh Segal, it's been an absolute pleasure spending this time with you and hearing your passion for this issue. Thank you for that passion. Thank you for caring about Canadians living in poverty and for working so hard to advance this cause for such a long time. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Mark.
And I want to let everybody know that our next event is next week on June the 4th, on Thursday, June the 4th, and it's very timely. It's a virtual book launch, a relaunch of a book by David Waltner Taves that is called On Pandemics, Deadly Diseases from Bubonic Plague to Coronavirus. So that's Thursday, June the 4th, at the same time, 1 p.m. So I hope you can join the Ottawa Public Library and the Ottawa Writers Festival then. Thank you for watching today. Have a great day.